Hello and welcome to a very special edition of HIV Justice Live, where we highlight the work that we and others are doing to advocate for HIV justice in conversation with fellow activists and allies. Today is HIV is Not a Crime Awareness Day, and for the first time, the day, which began 2 years ago in the United States, has gone global. And in a moment, I'll be joined by an inspiring group of community-based expert activists to help you understand exactly why we need a day like this. And hopefully you'll learn more about why ending HIV criminalization matters and what you can do about it. We're streaming live to both Facebook and YouTube. If you're watching live, why not share the link on your favorite social media platform right now? And you can post comments and questions to anyone on the show, which my colleague Sofía Várguez will share later in the show during the Q&A session. And if you're not watching live, then make sure you're catching up on YouTube, where you can show English subtitles that can also be auto-translated into any language. Now it's time to meet the guests who'll join me on my virtual sofa. Please welcome from the Global Network of People Living with HIV, Florence, Riako, and Anam, joining us from Kenya. Hi, Florence. And
hi,
joining us, hi, and joining us from Namibia, HIV and human rights consultant Michaela Clayton. Hi, Michaela.
Hi, everyone. Hi, thanks for having me.
From the HIV Legal Network in Canada, Mikhail Golichenko. Hi, Misha. And from the SERO project, Andy Tapia from Mexico, and Kerry Thomas from Idaho.
Yeah, hey everyone, good to see you. Thanks for the invite. For sure.
Hi, welcome everyone. So it's rather fitting that we have two people from the SERO project, our wonderful sister organization based in the United States, because HIV is Not a Crime Awareness Day was the brainchild of your executive director, co-executive director, Kamaria Laffery. Now, the day was launched 2 years ago in collaboration with Elizabeth Taylor AIDS Foundation and involving community activists and public policy organizations across the United States. And now, for the first time, we've gone global. And this year's theme is You Care About Ending HIV Criminalization, You Just Don't Know It Yet. Misha, how does that theme resonate with you?
I think this is an excellent angle to look at HIV criminalization, because HIV criminalization plays so negative role on the development of law enforcement that really everyone should feel it when he or she looks at law enforcement, thinking that law enforcement is targeting key and vulnerable groups rather than going after serious crimes. I think it's an excellent angle.
Kerry, what does it mean to you?
Yeah, that's a great, again, thanks for being an opportunity to be here. And you're exactly right. But my focus is that it's really a motivator for me, because when I play that in my head and make the statement over and over again, it encourages me to stay focused. And basically it's a great conversation starter. I mean, when you're talking about people and talking to individuals, I can share that information and start the conversation. And I'm a big believer that any change that's going to come about starts with the one-on-one conversation.
Great. Now, Michaela, why do we need an HIV is Not a Crime Awareness Day?
I think because, when people think about criminalization in the context of HIV, they think about, criminalization of sex work, criminalization of same-sex sexual relations, about criminalization of drug possession and use, all of which obviously have a very negative impact on the response to HIV, quite apart from constituting fairly egregious human rights violations. But apart from that, what people often don't think about is that, HIV criminalization is also an issue, and that, criminalization of the behavior of people living with HIV in terms of exposure, non-disclosure, or transmission is equally troublesome in terms of the HIV response. Thanks.
Absolutely. Florence, do you agree?
I totally agree. And I think in addition, having a HIV is not a crime day, awareness day, or HIV criminalization awareness is critical because it takes people to the core of what criminalization does to people living with HIV. As a person living with HIV, having seen or experienced some of the things that this does to us, it takes away the very fundamental core of why we are in this world, our humanity. And so this awareness day is critical and important to take away from the usual readings of the law and to actually put the humanity needed for us to think a bit differently about how we address HIV issues.
Yeah. And Andy, why do you think so many people aren't even aware of HIV criminalization?
I think because HIV is such a taboo yet, and it's an issue very difficult to talk and tough to talk. So that's why most of the people don't know about HIV criminalization yet.
Yeah, so what do we mean when we talk about HIV criminalization? We're talking about criminal laws or prosecutions that single out people living with HIV, making us criminals for acts that wouldn't be crimes if we weren't living with the virus. We're talking about people going to prison because they couldn't prove they disclosed their HIV positive status before sex, even if that sex didn't risk any transmission, or because laws and courts don't understand how HIV is passed on, or even if HIV transmission is alleged, it's rarely ever proven. And even then, these are people who had no intention of passing HIV on. And there are also far too many cases that involve spitting and biting or breastfeeding, where people with HIV are treated so much worse than people without. And many people think it's okay to criminalize any of these behaviors if HIV is involved. So why do we think it's a problem? Misha, tell me one of the issues around HIV criminalization.
Well, I think my concern with HIV criminalization obviously is affected by the region I'm working for, and that's Eastern Europe and Central Asia. And that's the region where law enforcement still plays a very, very important role. And to me and to the countries I'm working for, and vulnerable and key populations from those countries, we all know that law enforcement and criminal laws, it's a very, very powerful and very, very blunt instrument, which should be used only in an extremely, extremely restrictive manner. HIV criminalization, and by HIV criminalization, I'm not only talking about the laws which are criminalizing such acts as HIV exposure or HIV transmission. I'm talking about criminalizing key and vulnerable groups such as people who use drugs, sex workers, people who are practicing same-sex relations. When police is incentivized and actually encouraged to go after these groups of population, very often police officers are just following the stigma which is entrenched in the society and turn themselves into the blunt instrument that actually perpetrates stigma. So rather than protecting vulnerable groups, rather than protecting the society, law enforcement becomes the instrument of evil, the instrument of stigma and discrimination. And that's a very dangerous thing. And that's why I think everyone should be concerned with these laws.
Thanks, Misha. Michaela, what's your take on this?
You know, in the region that I come from and work primarily in is southern and East Africa. These laws were often touted in the beginning, and I think we'll talk about this a bit later in more detail, but they were touted in the beginning as being laws that were being put in place to protect women. And what really concerns me about these laws is that, and we've seen it over and over again, that they have quite the contrary effect. They are disproportionately used against women, and women are more negatively impacted by these laws. So that's why I'm particularly concerned about HIV criminalization. Thanks.
Thanks. And Andy, what are your thoughts?
For example, I think being open about my HIV status could put me in danger or risk with my sexual partners, so using it against me legally or even in terms of physical violence, just because of them knowing my status.
That's true. Florence?
I want to start by sort of also just talking about what Michaela said and what Kerry said. I think it's the fact that when people know your HIV status, then it can be used as a weapon against you. And because you have to prove that you actually disclosed and that the contents of disclosure are limited. I think I'll go to the women part because that is what I mostly have seen. It's women most likely are the ones who get to know their HIV status first. It's because they took a child to the hospital. It's because of the makeup of our bodies. And the fact that someone knew first, then they automatically become, responsible. And then they are accused of having brought the disease home, as that's what we like to say here. I also think that sorry to take long, but I think we take away from the actual crime. I see cases reported in Kenya, XYZ raped a child and infected them with HIV. And then we focus on the infected them with HIV part. And we forget that there was a sexual violation that took place. So I think there's a lot of distortion that happens with this focus on criminalization of HIV and its targetness. It targets people, but also opens up the space for people to extort and harm, and particularly for women to face gender-based violence.
That's all so true. And Kerry, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's extremely well put. And if we look at all what the panel has all discussed, and it's a broad range, and I believe that we have to broaden what criminalization is, because as each person has pointed out, there's different stages or different avenues into when we talk about criminalization. And the end result is that when someone is sentenced and they are found guilty, the sentences are way disproportionate until the harm that is actually done. And the reason why the courts can get away with that is that, or maybe get away is not the way put that, but the reason why that is because it starts with what everyone else is talking about. Way before the actual sentencing, the momentum's already been there. So when someone's found guilty, well, of course they're going to get a long sentence because they're a sex worker, because they've been irresponsible, because they're a marginalized person, because they're not sure if they can reveal their status to their partner. That's what stigma and that's what criminalization does. So criminalization is not someone getting charged and found guilty in the court of law. Criminalization starts with the individuals cautious about even going to get tested in the first place. That's what stigma and criminalization is to me. And the end result of that is disproportionate prison sentences.
Those are just some of the many reasons why HIV criminalization hurts public health, human rights, and our communities. And to learn more, you'll find publications like this one and many more in the resource library of the HIV Justice Academy. Now, we at the HIV Justice Network document many unjust HIV criminalization cases on our global HIV criminalization database. But I'm sure each of my guests knows of a case that really exemplifies why you should care about ending HIV criminalization. Let's start with Michaela.
Thanks. I think for me, one of the most egregious cases was a case in Zimbabwe, where, like many other women, Samakilisiwe Malilo discovered her HIV status during pregnancy, as Florence alluded to earlier. It's excuse me. It's most often women who find out their status first within a heterosexual relationship because of attending antenatal care. And also, like many women, she was in a physically abusive relationship. There was real physical violence, and the fear of physical violence made it initially very difficult for her to disclose to her husband that she was living with HIV. But she did, and they stayed together. About a year later, the physical abuse and the gender-based violence got so bad that she reported him to the police and left him and sought a protection order. And what happened then was that the husband reported to the police that she had deliberately infected him with HIV She was unrepresented in court. She was convicted and sentenced to imprisonment, leaving behind a breastfeeding infant and other children. And there was no evidence of whether there was in fact transmission, who had been infected first. There was no evidence of that. And this is really, for me, an example of how these laws negatively impact, particularly in this region, on women more than men, and also that they are being used very often as a form of retribution for against women for reporting gender-based violence or leaving a bad relationship. So for me, I think that's one of the more significant ones. Thanks.
Thanks, Michaela. That's just so terrible. Misha, do you have a case that makes you so angry?
The case of this year, and fitting the topic of our discussion, is coming from Uzbekistan, where a transgender woman was a target for a police sting operation, where police agent played a role of a client, got into contact with the lady, received sex work, and then opened the door into the apartment where he and the transgender woman were to let the police officers in. They documented the so-called crime scene, and the transgender woman, she was prosecuted for same-sex relations. And it's a horrible case in a way that, imagine your police officers doing this, planning, executing the sting operation, which takes up the resources, which takes up the time of police officers. It's quite elaborate operation, the way it's described in the sentence. And you think, that's what my police officers are doing? That's what I'm paying for? And it's a horrible impact on the society and on people otherwise very vulnerable. People from LGBT community in Uzbekistan are already severely stigmatized. They experienced a very high level of violations of their human rights. Very often they are beaten up by their relatives, people from the general public. Police should protect them. Instead, police is targeting them, exploiting their vulnerability, and actually corroding itself. Police force, when acts in this manner, is corroding from inside, is getting useless instrument. It's playing the devil's card rather than protect the society. It's a horrible case, and the justification for such activities comes from the notion that allegedly police is preventing HIV. That's the level of hypocrisy we see in Uzbekistan, and that's very worrisome.
That is terrible, absolutely terrible. Andy, is there a case that really is impacting you?
Yes, in Santiago, in the north of Argentina, a 39-year-old man was arrested after 6 years of prosecution for donating blood for his father. He was requested for donating it since there was no donators at all. And so he was arrested for trying to save his father in his surgery. And that, I think, it's awful in so many ways. Yeah.
Wow. Wow. What about you, Florence?
A lot of cases infuriate me, but I think I will talk about this current, very recent case in Kenya where a 24-year-old house help, we call them house managers here, was arrested initially because her boss noticed that, watching the CCTV cameras, that she spits on their food before she serves it, and was arrested because of this. And then while they were searching his room, the police was searching his room, they came across her ARVs and is now being charged under the Section 6 of the Kenya's Sexual Offences Act. It is infuriating for me because as someone who has been in this field for many, many years, one of the things we have walked around in schools in every aspect of the world is to tell people modes of HIV transmission. The girl spit on food. And there is, of course, some conversations that need to happen. If that happened, this is allegedly, but I don't think they need to be in court or having to be in remand prison because they spit on food. But the only reason they are currently, facing the law is because they're now being charged in a Sexual Offences Act for not disclosing their status. And it's the HIV angle that now looks like, as Terry said earlier, the case is taken a little bit too seriously and out of context. So this is in October 2023, and it is with all the progress in science and our understanding that people are probably better informed. It's the reality that what criminalization can do is take progress back. Yeah.
And these cases they're just the tip of the iceberg. There's 80 countries around the world with HIV-specific criminal laws, and many more are using other kinds. In the last 5 years, we've documented almost 400 cases that we know of. Now, many of these, unfortunately, have happened in the United States. So, Kerry, do you have a case you want to tell us about?
Yeah, no doubt. And also, again, thank you. And it's amazing because with the day being HIV is not a crime awareness day. This is so important that we emphasize how this is something that's global. It's not something that's in one neighborhood or one isolated part of the world. It is global. And the example I would use, there's a man in Idaho who was sentenced to 30 years in prison for non-disclosure, and despite following the advice of his clinic, of his doctor, he was on medication, had undetectable viral load. He was used a condom. He did all the things that we say we want responsible people who are positive to do. And despite that, it came down to he said, she said, which we talked about as well, is that the onus incident becomes on the person who's positive, not as a couple. It's not a conversation, and it's not about. No longer becomes about medical facts. So yeah, that's the example I would use, is that it was and that warranted through the court system a 30-year sentence.
And thanks for sharing that egregious case. But the man you're talking about is here today on our show because it's you, Kerry.
Yeah, no doubt.
It is you, and it's amazing. It's so fantastic to have you here today out of prison. But
sure.
Tell us how could this have happened?
Sure, and I think that again, that's why it's so important. I can't say it enough that we look at a broader portion of what criminalization is and what it is not. Criminalization is not about prevention, because most of the statutes has an affirmative defense that if you did disclose. Well, disclosure in and of itself is not prevention. Prevention is prevention. And what I mean by that, prevention is getting as many people tested and on medication. If you really are concerned as a society that we want to stop the spread, then you want to encourage more testing and get people on medication. Criminalization isn't that. And so in my case, that's what we case. And I was sentenced. I did take a plea agreement because the media and the backlash comes with that. And there's other people I need to consider. I had to consider my elderly parents. I had to consider I chose to consider my son, who at the time was 13 years old. And then Idaho is a very, it's a smaller state. And so the amount of pressure that I felt at the time, and working with my attorney, that I felt at the time the best thing was to take a deal. A plea deal is what I mean by that. And so I was sentenced to 30 years of incarceration. And then through the help of SERO, and I think we'll talk on this a little bit later, I started really becoming an advocate. And I had to ask myself the tough questions of what do I want my life to be? What is it that I want? How can I best serve with dignity 30-year sentence, and what I want my legacy to be? And so not with an idea of looking at, if I do this, I will get out. I wanted to be able to give back. And I looked at how I was raised, and my father was in the military, and we traveled a lot. And so every year and a half, I'd have to go to a new school. And I learned really quickly to put my head down, not to make any waves, and you'll be able to get through it. Now that might work really well when someone's 14 years old, or 12 or 10 years old. But the time of my incarceration, when I first found out my HIV status, I went to that same way of troubleshooting, of problem solving. I kept my head down. I didn't say anything. I kept quiet. I just figured that everything would go away. And what I've learned, and one of the biggest regrets I have, is in 1988, I didn't speak up. I didn't become more actively involved. And so I carried that with me, and this prison sentence is that, no, it's time for me to stand up. It's time for me to talk about the pain of criminalization, to bring a face to that, to be back to what it is, the back end of it, and the impact it has not only on me, but also my family, my employer, my friends, the community as a whole. So like you're right, so someone touched on, it is so true that it seems like we're protecting women or we're protecting the victims. And then the system, actually, in a way, I can make an argument, and I think a successful argument, that we're criminalizing the alleged victims as well, because we're not giving them factual information. We're saying these people, this group of people, this individual is a bad person. We're not talking, we step away and think about if as a society, if we were willing to talk about the truth, about the medical facts of HIV, think about what a relief that would be to victims. We want to have that conversation. And in a statute that's founded on non-disclosure, it's interesting, but we don't want to have a conversation. We want to criminalize someone for not saying something, but we don't want to talk about the facts, and specifically the medical facts, and how important it is, and what are the actual steps for prevention. And it's kind of double speaking, and I only can conclude that it comes back to the stigma that we place on HIV and the people who are infected.
So one of the things that is so incredible about your story, Kerry, apart from that egregious sentence, is that you became an activist from behind bars. I'm feeling so emotional about this, but I mean, I remember the HIV is Not a Crime Training Academy back in 2016 in Huntsville, Alabama. Mm-hmm. And you were speaking so eloquently to the audience by phone. It was so powerful. And then a few weeks later, you participated in our international pre-conference Beyond Blame at the AIDS conference in Durban. And you've told me you haven't seen the footage. So let's take a look at it now.
Sure, I appreciate that.
Kerry, yeah, he's here. He's actually here. Kerry, just for the benefit of everybody sitting here, which is amazing, I wish you could see it, could you let us know where you're calling from?
A prison in Idaho.
So we're going to hand the phone over to Nana.
It's a great honor and an opportunity to get a chance to speak with you guys. This stigma related to HIV produces discrimination in areas such as housing, employment, access to medical care and treatment, even what I call the pursuit of happiness. And it's the same stigma that continues to drive the toxic criminalization that harms far too many people living with HIV. And we look at it, even society as a whole. I think everyone in this room all recognize that HIV criminalization impedes HIV prevention and the treatment efforts. So the question that I bring is, what can I do, or how can I help change this? Today, I believe that the chronic illness of HIV, is manageable and full of hope. I believe truly HIV is beyond blame.
And Kerry, you just got a standing ovation here at Beyond Blame in Durban, South Africa.
Kerry, how do you feel seeing that?
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. That seems like a long time ago back now when you think about it, when I think that we've all come a long way. And it's interesting that from the moment I worked with SERO, started getting familiar with SERO and started become an advocate. And this is like a little, if I can indulge me for a little bit and I'll put it in the context of a prison story, that when I got involved with SERO and talking to Sean and to Cindy and all the folks that were involved, I was working in the prison laundry, which is pretty typical. But it was a safe space. It was just you and the machines, tons of dirty clothes, smelly clothes, but then it was really isolated, and the cycles are long, so I could read information I was being sent to from Sean and across the world and everything. But when I started getting involved, what I realized is I was hiding. I was doing the same thing I did as a kid, when at age 24, because it was a safe environment. And so I asked, I took another work assignment in the recreation area. And if anyone's familiar with prison, that's kind of the hub of the facility. I mean, and so I went from being around a total of maybe 4 to 5 people to being around 1,000 people at one time. And it was overwhelming. But what the point is, I had to put myself out there. So when people say that, why did you get involved in being an advocate? Because there's people like yourselves, everyone on this call and across the world that are doing the work, doing the heavy lifting. So who was I to be safe and comfortable with my book and only around 5 people and some word machines and clean clothes? Don't get me, that is a perk. But I needed to get out there and to be visible and to find my voice. And so that's kind of what led up to my involvement of becoming an advocate. And one of the first conversations that Sean and I had when I decided to participate was never about me getting out of prison. It was going to be able to tell my story. I fully assumed that I would do 30 years. And I wanted to know, like I said before, I wanted to for my son to know that his dad was stood up for something. And that something is the truth. And the something is to make a difference in other people's lives, not to directly impact mine. And I'm thankful that with the community that's fighting against the criminalization of HIV, the momentum started, and people in Idaho specifically, I got to give them credit, were willing to start to have the conversation, at least from the Department of Corrections. They wanted to have the conversation. And so what started off as a phone call, being the first time I participated was in a little booth. It was only a one-way phone. There were officers outside the door, and I was cautioned. It was probably a safe way to put it, not to disparage the Department of Corrections, but here, go ahead and have fun and participate. Those were the guidelines. So that's what it started at. And toward the end, I was able to have an open conversation with the staff and they really wanted to know what it meant to be, what HIV criminalization meant. And finally, I want to touch on it's so powerful that you mentioned the beginning of HIV criminalization, because Cindy Stein was my main source of contact when I was inside. So we spent hours on the phone call, and one particular morning we were just happened to be on a call, nothing planned. We were just talking in general. And I remember I turned, because the phones are in the day room, which is a very populated area. And it was the morning, and I happened to turn, and the View was on. And I knew that we had the HIV is Not a Crime Awareness Day, but that episode with the View just happened to be on when I turned my chair to look at the TV. And so that was so much a powerful moment to me, that I saw the SERO logo on the View stage. I heard them talking about HIV is Not a Crime Awareness Day, and I heard them talk about the importance of it. And so to me, this day is always something that's special. It was a connection, a further connection that Cindy and I were able to form. And through the relationship with Cindy and I'm sitting here today with everyone here. So yeah, I definitely appreciate the opportunity.
Kerry, it's amazing, that you made it to an international platform when you were behind bars. And in fact, it was the speech you gave at Beyond Blame was highlighted at the closing of the main AIDS conference. I mean, the reality is that when you speak, people listen, whether it's from behind bars or today, with the same eloquence and dignity. It's just wonderful to have you with us today, Kerry. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'd be really remiss to say it's not a me thing, it's a we thing that I say. And it's the examples of everyone on this panel that gave me the power and the voice to say the things that I had to say. And so, because I said, well, I want to live my life like that. Even incarcerated or not, I want to do what Edwin's doing. I want to do what Andy's doing. I wanted to have that kind of connection. So that where I think that what I've been told and shared with me that I was a motivation for some people is the exact opposite, in my opinion. It's what you folks have always done from day one, busting your backside, if I can say that, to find a level of justice to form a conversation. And if I think if it could happen for me, I'm so encouraged that it could happen across the world as well.
Wow. So Michaela, you were there in Durban. You helped do Beyond Blame with us. We've actually known each other a really long time, and you've been working on this issue even before me since the early 2000s, I think. We've come a long way, haven't we?
We have, and it's telling that you're asking me to tell about the history of HIV criminalization, Francis. I know I've gone a bit grey, but hey, there we go. First off, Kerry, without this being a mutual admiration society, I mean, you were always an inspiration for me in this work. I mean, I met you many, many years ago. I can't even remember when it was, whenever you first spoke on the phone. And you've reduced me to tears on a number of occasions in meetings, but it's been you were a source of inspiration. And so I'm glad that it goes both ways, right? So just very briefly, just talking a bit about the history of HIV criminalization and the response. And I'm talking from a Southern and East African perspective, obviously. I think the best way to describe this whole process from start to finish is it probably started as good intentions, but it was really, really bad law and policy, right? I think it's been alluded to already, but, at the beginning of this, of HIV criminalization, certainly in this region, it was women's groups who were lobbying for the adoption of these laws. And it was to protect women against infection. And I mean, you have to understand the context in which this happened, in a context where, in many of our countries across the region, gender power relations are really imbalanced. I mean, we have a very strong patriarchal society in our countries. And so, most women are not in a position to enforce safer sex decisions and so one could understand the rationale behind it. And it sort of really got off to a start in 2004 when there was a meeting that happened in N'Djamena in West Africa, which was supported by USAID at the time, to develop a piece of model legislation on HIV. So it wasn't specifically about criminalization. It was a model law on HIV to guide the HIV response and to also protect against stigma and discrimination and things like that, ironically, right? But in this law, there was a section that provided for a very vague and very broad offense of willful transmission. And this really started an epidemic of laws. I mean, we had the HIV epidemic. We now also had an epidemic of laws roaring through the region. And this was adopted not only in West African countries, but in many, many countries in the region. And so in 2000, so just to give you a bit of a timeline, so that was 2004. So after that, there were already kind of early warnings sounded on the negative impact of these kind of legal provisions. And especially in this region in terms of the potential disproportionate application against women living with HIV in Africa. In 2007, I used to be the director of an organization called ARASA, the AIDS and Rights Alliance for Southern Africa, for many, 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 many years. And we convened a meeting in South Africa because it was becoming increasingly apparent to us that it was really troubling, that there was a big, big push for these criminalization laws. And we were really concerned about what the impact of these laws may be. And so we convened this meeting and we got together this very diverse group of people, from women's organizations to people living with HIV to representatives of like churches to key populations. It was a big, big diverse bunch of people. And it was one of the meetings that sticks in my mind of the many hundreds of thousands of meetings I've been to in my life. It really sticks in my mind because it was one of those meetings where suddenly there were these light bulb moments where, like, as we started unpacking, what is the impact of these criminalization provisions in laws, particularly on women? And you could actually see it was like this, like clicking around the room. It was like, oh, actually, this is not such a great idea because, at the end of the day, women are the first to know, as Florence said earlier, women are the first to know their status when they go to antenatal care. They are, certainly in our region, blamed for bringing HIV home. They face domestic violence, gender-based violence, which makes it difficult very often for them to disclose their HIV status. They also can't insist on safer sex because of the patriarchy and because of the imbalance in gender power relations. They get thrown out when it's found out that they're living with HIV. They get thrown out of the house. They lose their inheritance, and they are very often the first to be prosecuted, whether it's by way of retribution or for whatever other reason. It's that, that's how it works. And suddenly there was like this, whoa, actually, this is really probably not a good idea. And then we sort of started seeing, and there were a lot of diverse views. There were women's groups who were like really strongly still saying criminalization is the way to go. But I think it started the seed of kind of people thinking about, well, actually, maybe not. And then after that, we saw, a number of developments that sort of rolled out. There was, in 2008, we saw, for example, UNAIDS and UNDP developing a policy brief on HIV criminalization, where they recommended specifically to repeal HIV-specific criminal laws and to only use general criminal law in the case where there is actual intentional transmission, where transmission infection occurs and there was an intent to transmit. And then in 2009, we saw the developments that a number of us were involved in with the publication called 10 Reasons Why HIV Criminalization Harms Women, which kind of sets out the reasons that I've already referred to. And then we saw in 2012, the Global Commission on HIV and the Law also made very specific, strong recommendations about not having HIV-specific criminal laws and only using criminal law in the most egregious of cases where there is transmission and it was intentional. I think the civil society movement around this really kicked off. I mean, there were a lot of people working on it, but I think it really kicked off also in 2012 when we had the Oslo Declaration, which was really, I think, the start of the global movement from a civil society, international civil society perspective to stop HIV criminalization. And then coming to the end, not the end, but to close it to the end of the story, is what I've always thought was quite amazing is that in 2019, ARASA, the organization that I was the director of, entered into a consortium with HIV Justice Network, with a lot of other of the organizations represented on this sofa today, this couch, including the Legal Network, including GMP Plus, including Positive Women's Network, oh my goodness, Positive Women's Network in USA, the Southern African Litigation Center, the SERO project. So just like everybody sitting here was part of that well, maybe not the individuals, but the organizations at the beginning were part of that. And what the other thing that was significant about it was that we managed to get quite a nice deal of funding from the Robert Carr Fund for Civil Society Networks. And it was because ARASA had more experience as an organization. It actually was a Southern-led consortium from a funding point of view. So that was significant. And as Edwin says, we've worked together for many years on this issue. And it's come a long way. There's still a long way to go. And Kerry, again, it's the first time that I've seen you out of prison, and it's a very significant moment for me. Thank you.
Michaela, thank you for the history, for the support all over the years, but also for your pioneering work on highlighting the impact of HIV criminalization on women. But let's move now to Eastern Europe and Central Asia, which has some of the worst HIV criminalization laws and the highest number of unjust HIV criminalization cases in the world. Now, Misha, you're a senior policy analyst working with the HIV Legal Network in Canada, where your focus is on the ECA region. But Misha, is it as bad as it sounds?
It is. There are some positive developments, obviously, and I'll talk about them later. But unfortunately, what we have in the region for the last 30 years, and it's I'm counting from the time when the Soviet Union dissolved and countries or in hope that the positive democracy-driven ideas and changes will soon turn into reality. For many countries, it didn't happen, never happens. And police still plays the role. And I, as a former police officer, during my years with police, I started questioning myself about this. Probably one of the most important issues any human being would bump into in his or her life, the issue of how easily and quickly the good could turn into evil, and vice versa. And with the police and with the police officer, the line between the good and evil is so thin. It's so often an absolutely invisible line that crossing it back and forth is a norm, almost a daily routine for many police officers in that countries. And that's why in those countries, phenomena like HIV criminalization or criminalization of vulnerable groups should be at the core of the reform. If I am back to 90s, I would definitely push for the agenda for police reforms to definitely address this, because HIV criminalization is a mechanism, I would say a perfect mechanism that lets stigma hijack the law enforcement and criminal justice system and justify law enforcement officers' pathway into the dark side and remain there permanently. It really is that toxic. And as I said, we have positive development. We have cases that we won, and it's cases very similar in their nature to what happened to Kerry. But we also have some changes on the systematic level. Just recent example from Tajikistan, where the Supreme Court adopted and passed a very important resolution addressing HIV criminalization, bringing the entire criminal justice system in Tajikistan more or less in line with international norms and standards. And we are to see whether or not this resolution will really trickles into practice. We hope it will. Such positive developments are really, really good to see and hear about. But the countries in Eastern Europe and Central Asia essentially remains in the same very format and framework they were 30 years ago. And that's a very unhappy moment.
Yeah. Thanks, Misha. I mean, the fact that you used to be a policeman, we're so happy that you're on our side now. Thanks so much for sharing that. So we're streaming live to both Facebook and YouTube. Do you have any questions or comments? Put them in the comments section under either of the live streams. So HIV is not a Crime Awareness Day takes place on the 28th of February for a number of reasons. It's a date that bridges two major US awareness months, Black History Month in February and Women's History Month in March. And it's also a symbolic nod to the legacy of the late Elizabeth Taylor, loved as much for her AIDS activism as for her many memorable movies, and whose birthday was yesterday. And the Elizabeth Taylor AIDS Foundation's now made ending HIV criminalization in the United States a priority. And this year, for HIV is not a Crime Awareness Day, they've released a video based on their most recent campaign, Stuck in the 80s. Let's take a look.
The 80s, where we discovered the art of pairing neon with neon and the harsh reality that hairspray is damaging the ozone layer. Despite learning these important truths over the past 40 years, there's a serious area where outdated ideas persist: HIV criminalization laws. 30 states still cling to 80s-era laws rooted in myths and stigmas about HIV transmission.
Across the country, outdated science and prejudices have been written into our laws. And those laws are doing real harm to real people.
The Elizabeth Taylor AIDS Foundation's Stuck in the 80s campaign is a rallying cry for justice and the urgent need to repeal these laws nationwide. This campaign shows the nation that just like old phones and fax machines, HIV criminalization laws are relics from the past, unnecessary and simply unjust.
But the good news is that bad laws can be unwritten.
Our message started in key states, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Indiana, and is spreading thanks to hundreds of thousands who have shared or engaged with the hashtag Stuck in the 80s, content and resources. And we're continuing to mobilize action by calling on people to contact their legislators to demand justice. Visit etaf.org/HIV is not a crime to help us move past the 80s and repeal these discriminatory laws once and for all.
Now, Kerry, Idaho's HIV criminalization law is definitely one of those 80s relics. So what are you and your colleagues at the SERO Project hoping to do there?
Yeah, no doubt. It's those laws about as outdated as those dance steps, I think. So, that's kind of something we got to move on. And yeah, we're working with SERO 100% across the country to starting with our legislators. And like what I believe is start to have the conversation. It's a slow, grueling process. I don't want to give the illusion that it's not, but yeah, we're just starting the one-on-one correlation building, getting people in each individual state, specifically in Idaho, in my case, to start coming to the table to sit down and have the conversation to talk about how things have changed and to modernize at the very least to modernize the statutes. I personally believe they should be done away with completely, but to have the conversation, let's just bring it up to speed. It's just, if it's a medical case, let's let the medical community decide on that. So yeah, we're actively participating in building coalitions, getting neighborhoods to talk, and it's a fascinating time. And again, as always, any part that I can play in that is greatly appreciated.
Yeah, well, so far 16 US states have repealed or reformed or modernized their laws. So there is precedent. I know it's not always easy, but really good luck with that, and kudos to all of our colleagues in the United States who are working so hard. But let's stay in the Americas, but move south to Latin America and the Caribbean. And Andy, you work as the Latin America and Caribbean coordinator at SERO. So what does that involve?
My role at SERO involves reinforcing the network of advocates and organizations of people living with HIV against HIV criminalization. So through webinars, grant opportunities, and scholarship opportunities, we try to stay together and communicate it, which helps a lot when it comes to injustice in Latin America, because we are connected and always looking for ways to support each other.
That's great. And you're also working with our colleague Sofía, who you'll meet a little bit later. Now, I know that you're based in Mexico City, and
Yes.
something rather exciting happened there a few months ago.
That's right. In January 8, Article 159, which criminalized people with HIV because of danger of contagion, was repealed. So we're very happy here in Mexico City. It's the fourth state in Mexico that achieves this. So we're now trying with Quintana Roo. We're supporting Quintana Roo, which is in the process now. We're very, very happy here.
Yeah, it's so fantastic. And there seems to be real momentum, which is really great to hear about. But tell us about your plans for an HIV is Not a Crime Awareness Day event in Mexico City. It's slightly different to this one.
Right. So I belong to the ballroom community, which gathers transgender, non-white. So lots of different people. The real diversity is right there. So we're organizing with the hand of Gillette and Diana Feliz from Gillette, ball themed with categories about people living with HIV, famous people living with HIV like Billy Porter, like Andy Bell from Erasure or Kit Haring. So it's going to be all about expressing through dance, art, and just like celebration of diversity. And that's going to be all themed about HIV.
It looks fabulous. Now, I know you've had your own journey living with HIV, and I'd love to know when you became aware of HIV criminalization and became concerned about it?
So the first time that I heard about it was through a partner that told me that that was before my status, that if he ever had someone as a couple living with HIV, he would like go to make a, to use the law against them. And I was like, is that possible? And that was such a red flag for me. It was a deal breaker. So that was the first time I heard it. So when I got my status, I was like afraid that somebody ever would use that against me. And so that's the time that I really got to know that we are in danger in some places, not here in Mexico City, thank God. But now that's why it's very important that everywhere around the world, these laws disappear.
Yeah. Now, Florence, though, those disclosure issues, those fear of disclosure, that must be very familiar to you.
Yes, it is indeed. I think my view of what disclosure is it depends. I think there is the benefit of people sharing the HIV status for the help they may need, or just to be able to be free to exist. And I'm loving the work that is coming up in Mexico. But I think disclosure can only happen, or its benefits can only be realized if it's safe. For many people living with HIV, unfortunately, that has not been the reality. There is the law, but then there is the determination of what that law does generally to people's lives, even those people who are not standing on the stand and being accused publicly, but people have been abused, extorted, or all of a sudden made to. I feel like people living with HIV have just been categorized as this either careless people who went and got the disease, or dangerous people who now have a disease, they're just looking for someone to go and give it to. And it's these categorizations that make everyone just go like, and she has HIV. And then there's this reaction to the HIV, and everything else is lost in even the context of the information. And so for me, it's a story that is supposed to be freeing, but oftentimes it is the one thing that I have seen puts people in the worst form of danger, and particularly for women for whom the systems are not that friendly in the first place. Then the vulnerabilities get very heightened and in the worst possible ways. And I think it's also compounded for people from marginalized groups, and I'm just going to segue into some aspects of intersectionality here, because if you are from the LGBTQ community or you're a sex worker, there are all these other compounded stigmatizations or prejudices that you already are facing, and also criminalization just by existing that you're also already facing. So if you add on the HIV, then it becomes, I don't know, if the HIV criminalization also already takes away your humanity, whatever of it is left, then it's swiped away. And so I think the reality of how criminalization affects people's lives and dehumanizes them and okays, violence and intense experiences for people is something that we must speak about. I was in a conference last week and we were told it's not to say disclosure anymore. Apparently it's sharing your status. Times have changed, just the laws, I guess. Yeah.
So you're saying you go to a lot of high-level meetings as the co-executive director of the global network of people living with HIV. So how do you make sure that the voices of people living with HIV are heard at the global policy level? How can we influence what's happening at the global level?
I think I don't know any other way ever since I started working in this field than to use our stories. There is power in our stories of vulnerabilities. And I think I will pause a bit and say a big thank you to Kerry, because it's stories that inspire other stories to come out. And it's the moving away from your comfort zone and putting yourself in that space and in that spotlight, and to being vulnerable openly and to just put yourself out there, and there's anything that could come out of it, some of it not good, but it's to do it anyway. And so I think the global network of people living with HIV, organizations like SERO Project, GNP+, HJW, various organizations that are key populations and people living with HIV based, use innovative ways to bring these stories as organically and as truly as possible. We will package it in data if we have to. The People Living with HIV Stigma Index is one of those ways. We will find various aspects, animations. Young people are always finding innovative ways of bringing and making sure these stories and what the actual sense of the policies and the laws actually affect people. But I think it also requires a lot of education on what these processes are globally. For a global process to happen, it means member states were involved. It means countries were involved. There are people in those countries. If we can mobilize at country level to start to influence and shape at the most localized level possible, and to spread out the opportunities and the capacities of our communities resource-wise to ensure that there's action at that level. And so there's just various levels of the action that then feeds at global level, but also what's won at the global level has to come and be translated into action at country level. So I don't know any other way. It's what I've seen worked. It's what I would always ask that we invest in, because it is the people living with HIV or facing the criminalization or facing the actual experiences that know best how to inform the policies that need to change.
Thanks, Florence. So we've heard a few examples already, but in the past 10 years, more than 35 jurisdictions in 17 countries have repealed or reformed their HIV criminalization laws. And increasingly more judges are making sound legal decisions based on up-to-date science. And Florence, that's a part of that bigger picture of science and human rights positively influencing HIV policy, isn't it?
It is. And I think I was looking at the Elizabeth Taylor's organization video, and I was just sitting here and reflecting. Right. I think everything has progressed except people's perception of who a person living with HIV is. Science has progressed. I mean, the biggest public health information we can get everyone to know right now is that anyone who is on HIV treatment and is of undetectable viral load cannot pass HIV to a sexual partner. I feel like that is the biggest news, but no one knows about it because HIV people will have sex is the reaction that everyone has to this. And I think it's if we start to, I mean, COVID has taught us you cannot criminalize your way out of an epidemic. You will not. And we've seen this happen in various other pandemics and epidemics we've experienced over the years. We have to address public health issues with information, with the tools people need to use the information you've given them. So if there are prevention interventions that people need to have, then there is progress in science. Let's make the information known to people. Let's get the treatment. Let's get the prevention interventions, PrEP, the depivirine ring, anything that we can put in the hands of people to prevent HIV. Let's actually do the work that is public health and stop hiding around laws, because you can't arrest everyone. You will only arrest one person, but then you will scare many people and not make it possible for people to come forward and get tested and get on HIV treatment. And if they're on HIV treatment, use it, because now you can not only pass the virus, but you can live healthy, quality lives, and you can thrive and live positively with HIV. So I think the progress in science is way ahead. We have to do what we have to do to get people moving along. To the face of HIV is different. The story of HIV is different. It's good and it's hopeful, and we can all get on board with it.
Yeah, so talking of science's positive influence and telling stories, we produced a short video called Wise Story about the criminalization of a woman living with HIV for breastfeeding. Let's take a look, and this is based on a true story.
Today I'm going to tell you a story. It is a story about injustice, but it's also a story about courage and about women standing up for their rights. It all started at a village meeting. Mwai just wanted to help. Her neighbor, Ngozi, handed her baby to Mwai for a few minutes. When Ngozi came back, the others said that Mwai had breastfed the baby. They said Ngozi's baby would get sick because Mwai had HIV. When the police came for her, Mwai was terrified. What was happening? The police said Ngozi's baby could get HIV because of Mwai's milk. Mwai was alone, confused, and scared. At the trial, Mwai was convicted for doing an act likely to spread an infectious disease dangerous to life. She was sentenced to 9 months imprisonment with hard labor. A lawyer came to the prison and offered to help. He got reports from doctors to show that Ngozi's baby could not get HIV from Mwai. Mwai was taking ARVs, medicine to keep her healthy and lower the amount of HIV in her body. If Ngozi's baby got any milk from Mwai, there would not be enough HIV to pass on the virus. The judge at appeal listened to the evidence about HIV and breast milk. She ruled that Mwai did not do anything likely to spread a dangerous disease. Mwai did not commit a crime. Mwai could go home.
And you can see the rest of the video on our YouTube channel. But Michaela, you were involved in this case, weren't you? And it didn't stop there.
Sorry. Yeah, I was involved in that case. As you heard from the video, the court heard on appeal, they heard expert evidence from a medical person, and mine was the other expert evidence about the impact of these laws on human rights and on the HIV response. So yes, I was involved in that, and it was a great success at the end of the day, but it took a while to get there. Yeah.
And then because there was a proposed criminalization law in Malawi, women became aware of the problems of HIV criminalization. Our wonderful supervisory board member, Sarai Chisala Templehoff, helped to empower a group of women who then went to Parliament and made their voices loud and clear, didn't they? It was fantastic.
It was incredible. I mean, Sarai did a brilliant. The organization did a great job. I mean, it was really it really was about grassroots networks of women living with HIV who went to Parliament, and when the bill was being debated, and protested against the inclusion of this criminalization clause in the HIV bill. And it was, I mean, what they did was, what Sarai and her colleagues did was really brilliant, because what they did was that they provided the women with information, they supported them with information about, went through each provision of the law and sort of unpacked what that meant for women living with HIV on the ground. And so it was, which is how it should be. It's, women living with HIV should be at the forefront of this. And we must be investing in, strengthening the capacity of women living with HIV to engage in this kind of advocacy and lobbying at Parliament. But it was incredible. The women were there, and they were saying to parliamentarians, like the parliamentarians were saying things in the debate, like, we need to protect the unborn children against, mother-to-child transmission. And there was one woman who stood up And she said, and Sarai will tells the same, tells the story. She says, this woman stood up in Parliament and she said, before you care about the baby in my womb, I care about the baby in my womb. It's my body and I care. And every time the section with the criminalization clause came up, all the women would stand up and they would sing and chant. They had a song that you saw briefly in the video with banners and posters saying, no to Section 43, no to Section 43. And as a result, it was removed. And when the act was finally passed, that clause was removed. So it was the most incredible example of, of the strength of grassroots, community-led advocacy in Parliament to remove the clause. Yep.
And it was also the impact on HIV criminalisation on women was a key factor in the repeal of the HIV criminalisation law in Zimbabwe, which happened a few years ago too, and you were involved in that as well.
Gosh, I've been everywhere. Yeah, it was. It was. Yes, it was. And again, this was a case. It was actually really interesting because it finally, this law was only repealed in 2022. Eventually, the law was passed that repealed the original criminal provision. But it really was the result of a multi-year, multi-stakeholder campaign, with a bunch of civil society organizations from Zimbabwe and across the region, actually. And in fact, across the world, there was support from as well. But sort of they were sensitizing both communities and members of parliament about the impacts of the criminalization provision to garner support for for the repeal, for the law to be passed that repealed the criminal provision. And notably, one of the members of parliament who became a strong supporter of the repeal of this criminal provision was a parliamentarian called Dr. Ruth Labode, who really was the champion of the decriminalization. But she was another, she was a woman who at the outset of this process had been pushing for criminalization because of wanting to, protect her female constituents, right? But because of the, sort of becoming aware of what this law actually did in practical effect and the impact it had on women, she was like the stalwart amongst the parliamentarians, getting them to pass the law that repealed the criminalization. So yeah, both examples, really important examples of grassroots advocacy about the importance of sensitizing decision makers about the impact of the laws that they are deciding on. And also it's a lesson in terms of how long it takes to get these things to happen. In Zimbabwe, for example, it took a long time for this law reform to happen, but people kept on and kept on. So yeah, both good stories.
Amazing. But and law reform is happening all over the world. Really, we're having success stories everywhere. So Andy, you've talked about Mexico City and the 3 other jurisdictions in Mexico, but they aren't the only places in Latin America, Caribbean, are they, that have had successes?
That's right. For example, in Colombia, the court ruled in favor of eliminating HIV and hepatitis B transmission offense from the criminal code, as well as Belize, before their criminal code, criminalized exposure and non-disclosure, and it was repealed in July of 2024. And Argentina created an integral law for HIV and other situations, and guaranteed free access for treatment and HIV medication, and guaranteed participation of people living with HIV in the elaboration of the design and implementation of the public policies, and retirement for people living with HIV at the age of 50.
Fantastic. And Kerry, the fact that you're talking with us today, a free man, given you weren't due for release until 2038, that's a success in and of itself, isn't it?
It is, and I think what we hear from all the other panelists is a snapshot of that. And for me, it's just been the combined amount of work that goes involved, at least in my life. And an example I would say is Andy, because shortly after I was released, I had opportunity to attend the SERO staff retreat, and so which would happen to be in Pennsylvania. And so I was granted permission to go all the way across the world. I don't think I was out even 2 weeks by that time. And the power of this community shined through Andy, because she was the one everyone on staff was extraordinarily supportive. But I truly remember the time just sitting on the couch, just giving me the space just to figure this whole new world thing out. There's deer out there, and I haven't seen, where my part of the country, we don't see a lot of deer anyway, but I definitely haven't seen a deer in 15 years. So those experiences are what this movement is about. It's about the one-on-one reaction. We do the things big time and that are important as well, but it's about those one-on-one things. And for me, that when I say the success isn't about Kerry, that's what I mean. It's about the friendship, the people reaching out to help someone else. So yeah, I'm always grateful for Andy for that week we had a chance to spend in the retreat.
Yeah, so I'm hoping that our audience does now care about ending HIV criminalization. So what can people do about it? Very briefly, Andy, any tips from you?
So we should be empathic. I hope that all this information and the testimony from Kerry, which is an amazing person, show you that we're not criminals. We just want to live and be free and be as free as everyone else. So yeah, I just hope you really start caring, and even if you don't live with HIV, you start supporting us.
Misha.
I'd say share your stories, be passionate, changes will come, support each other, share love. Community is power, community is everything.
Wow. Florence?
I would say ask a question. Be curious and ask a question before you make assumptions. Educate yourself, ask the questions, and support us. Thanks.
Michaela.
I'm hoping my dogs won't join me as I speak, because they've just started barking, which is why you can see me going like this. Fund it. Fund the work. Wow. It's not popular. For some reason, people like to fund fluffy things. Funding decriminalization work is not popular. So please, philanthropists out there, private sector out there, funders out there, please fund this work. Where is the money for decriminalization?
Yeah. Thanks, Mikhail. Because with funding, we, the HIV Justice Network, with our partners, have produced many resources to help you understand the problem and find solutions that work for your specific locale. And as well as all the resources on our website, hivjustice.net, like the Global HIV Criminalization Database, we also have the online learning platform, the HIV Justice Academy. And if you want to keep up with the latest news, you can subscribe to our newsletter. But I'd now like to welcome our colleague Sofía Várguez, who joins us from Mérida in Mexico. She's been monitoring your comments and questions on our social media channels. Hi, Sofía.
Hello, thank you, Edwin. I'm very happy to be with you this morning or afternoon. We have had a very good reception on our social media, many kind messages thanking the panelists for their work, their advocacy, but above all for sharing their experiences. Some people in our audience have said to be very humble to listen to the real face of HIV criminalization. And they have posed 2 questions that I want to share with you. The first one is open to the panelists. Do you believe that COVID affected governments around the world for pushing the HIV decriminalization on migration? And the second question, it is for advocates and activists worldwide fighting to end HIV criminalization. What advice do the esteemed panelists have to share?
Well, thank you, Sofía. Thank you for the questions for the people watching. I don't know if who'd like to answer either of those questions. Obviously, we've been giving advice and tips all the way through the show, and hopefully those will help people. But would anyone like to take either of those questions? Michaela.
probably wasn't the appropriate way of indicating that I was happy to answer a question by sticking my finger in the air. But anyway, so just in terms of the second question about advocates and activists like worldwide, what advice do we have? Well, I'm not sure how esteemed I am as a panelist, but my advice would be to oh, sorry. I know it sounds weird, but you need to work from the top down and the bottom up, right? Mm-hmm. So you need to sensitize, I hate that word, increase the understanding of decision makers, parliamentarians, people who make laws and policies about why HIV criminalization is a bad idea, right? From a human rights perspective, from a public health perspective. But at the same time, you need to work from the grassroots upwards in terms of supporting community-led organizations. And this applies not only to HIV criminalization and decriminalization, but also to decriminalization more broadly around sex work, around, people who use and possess and use drugs, around same-sex sexual relations. One has to invest in and support, both in terms of financial support, but also in terms of capacity strengthening of grassroots community-led organizations to push from the ground up, to advocate for change, right? So that's my 2 cents worth.
Thanks, Michaela. Andy?
Thank you. I would like to add to that. I think for advocates, young advocates, it's very important to look at the people that open the path for us. So we don't have to start from zero because of their amazing work. We're right now, right here, for example, at this webinar. So don't take for granted. And we have to value the work of the people that started the fight.
Absolutely. Florence?
I'll take the first question and just say, I think there was a lot that the HIV response was useful for COVID response. The structures already existed, the mechanisms for decriminalizing, for running person-centered and human-centered work. These mechanisms that were already in existence were very useful in very many countries to set off what was needed for COVID. I am not very clear about the question, but I think just to say the fact that there were very many countries existing in the time of COVID that did not require that people living with HIV have to get special permission to travel must definitely have influenced a lot of how people were able to move, get back home in time, and withstand some of the realities that we faced around COVID.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, we at HIV Justice Worldwide published very early on in the COVID pandemic a statement saying that punitive responses to public health issues are never the answer, based on everything that we know from HIV criminalization. And it was really interesting to see in some places, in Poland, actually, when they added COVID to their communicable disease law, increased penalties for HIV. South Africa, who had never passed an HIV criminalization law, passed a COVID criminalization law, which was really problematic. And yet on the other side, we saw Illinois, one of the US states, repeal its HIV-specific criminal laws. And one of the reasons that I heard the lawmakers say, well, we don't criminalize COVID, why should we criminalize HIV? So it's very much a double-edged sword. It's important to learn the lessons from HIV. Don't criminalize communicable diseases. You know, public health doesn't require a criminal law approach, but some countries listen and others do the opposite. So, Sofía, anything else from our audience?
Just kind words so far. For example, this one from Sean. Great job, everyone. Watching this made me feel so proud of what we have accomplished by working together. Much love. And I feel that this summarizes very well the replies we have had in social media.
That's wonderful to hear, Sofía. And Sean, like Michaela, has been part of this movement for a very long time, and it's wonderful that you're watching. Hi there. Well, thank you, Sofía. Thanks for the questions and for the comments and the love. So hopefully you now know and care about ending HIV criminalization. And if you want to see this show again or share it with friends and colleagues, go to our YouTube channel where from March 1st, which is Zero Discrimination Day, you can bring up English subtitles that can also be auto-translated into any language. So thank you to my guests, Florence Anam, Michaela Clayton, Mikhail Golichenko, Andy Tapia, and Kerry Thomas, to our producer, Nicholas Feustel, to Sofía Várguez and the rest of the HGN team, to the Robert Carr Fund and Elizabeth Taylor AIDS Foundation, and to all of you for watching and commenting. See you soon for the next HIV Justice Live.